Before there was Bolívar, before San Martin, before even Lautaro, there was Hatuey, a Taíno chief from the island of Hispaniola. Hatuey holds a sacred place in the story of Latin America, not for founding a nation or commanding armies, but for being the first recorded freedom fighter of the New World. His resistance didn't win wars. It didn't establish a state, but it lit the first spark in a centuries-long fire of indigenous defiance. His final words would echo across time as a condemnation not just of conquest, but of the mindset that justified it. To understand Hatuey is to understand the birth of resistance in the Americas. He lived during the early years of Spanish colonization. Born sometime in the late 1400s on the island the Spanish called Hispaniola, today known as Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Before the arrival of Europeans, this land was home to the Taíno people, part of the larger Arawak cultural family that spanned much of the Caribbean. The Taíno were skilled farmers, artisans, and navigators. They lived in complex societies governed by chiefs called caciques, and they practiced a spiritual tradition that honored the zemis, ancestral spirits that connected the natural world to the divine. But when the Spanish arrived in 1492, everything began to unravel. What started as tentative exploration quickly turned into violent conquest. Spanish settlers demanded food, gold, and labor. Those who resisted were enslaved, tortured, or killed. Entire villages were burned. Children were mutilated as warnings. And through it all, the Spanish claimed divine justification, saying they came not only for gold, but for God. Hatuey watched as his world collapsed. He saw his people enslaved under the encomienda system, forced to mine gold that would never benefit them. He saw his family members die from exhaustion and foreign diseases. He saw friends hanged, drowned, or burned alive. And he saw that there would be no peace, not unless the Spanish were stopped. But Hatuey wasn't a passive victim of history. He was a strategist, a visionary. And in the face of unimaginable cruelty, he chose action. He gathered a small band of warriors and escaped Hispaniola entirely. He sailed across dangerous waters to the island of Cuba, hundreds of miles to the west, hoping to warn the Taíno people there before it was too late. When he arrived, he did not come as a refugee. He came as a prophet of fire. Holding up a basket filled with Spanish gold, Hatuey addressed the Cuban Taíno with words that would become legendary. He said, "This is the God the Spaniards worship. For this they fight, for this they kill, for this they persecute us, for this they betray us. Let us throw it into the river so they will follow it and leave us in peace." It wasn't just a speech. It was a rejection of the entire colonial logic. Hatuey was one of the first in the Americas to name what was happening. That conquest wasn't simply about territory or even religion. It was about greed, about wealth, about dehumanization masquerading as salvation. And he wasn't interested in appeasement. He was preparing for war. Hatuey began organizing resistance. He moved from village to village, rallying warriors, training them in ambush tactics, and building alliances. He knew the Spanish were better armed, with steel swords, muskets, and horses, but he also knew the forests and mountains of Cuba offered an advantage. His warriors used guerrilla tactics, striking quickly and disappearing into the jungle. They targeted supply routes, burned Spanish encampments, and freed enslaved Taíno along the way. Hatuey's resistance wasn't a single battle. It was a campaign of disruption, a war of shadows. The Spanish were stunned. They had assumed the conquest of Cuba would be as swift and brutal as it had been on Hispaniola. But Hatuey's movement slowed their progress. He exposed the vulnerability of their strategy. And most dangerously, he planted a seed in the minds of other indigenous leaders. That resistance was possible. Governor Diego Velázquez, determined to crush this rebellion, launched a military expedition to capture Hatuey. He used Spanish troops and indigenous auxiliaries, offering rewards for information and threatening villages with reprisal if they aided the rebels. After months of pursuit, Hatuey was eventually betrayed, surrounded, and captured. But even in chains, he would not be silenced. In 1512, Hatuey was sentenced to be burned alive, one of the most horrific punishments the Spanish could deliver. Before the execution, a Catholic priest approached him, offering baptism so that his soul could be saved and enter heaven. According to the chronicler Bartolomé de las Casas, Hatuey asked the priest a single question: "Are there Spaniards in heaven?" The priest replied, "Yes." Hatuey responded, "Then I do not want to go there." With those words, Hatuey rejected not only the physical violence of colonization, but the spiritual arrogance that underpinned it. His refusal to accept the Spanish God, even in death, became one of the most powerful acts of resistance in colonial history. He died in the flames, but his name would live on. The Spanish believed they had silenced him, but the fire they lit on that day in Cuba did not extinguish a rebellion. It ignited a legacy. Hatuey's story spread among the Taíno and beyond. He became a martyr, a warrior saint in the struggle against colonialism. Centuries later, his name would be invoked by revolutionaries, poets, and freedom fighters across the Caribbean and Latin America. In Cuba today, Hatuey is honored as the island's first national hero. His image appears in statues, murals, and literature. His name has been given to towns, schools, and even a popular brand of beer. Though the irony of commercializing a symbol of anti-colonial resistance is not lost on many. Still, his legacy endures. He is remembered not for military victories, but for moral clarity, for seeing the truth behind conquest, for speaking it, and for refusing to bow to it. Hatuey reminds us that resistance doesn't always come from generals or kings. Sometimes it comes from those who have nothing left to lose but refuse to surrender their dignity. He was not a ruler of a vast empire. He had no standing army or fortress city. What he had was vision, conviction, and the courage to speak truth to power, even as that power prepared to kill him. In the broader context of Latin American history, Hatuey's role is foundational. He marks the beginning of a long arc of resistance that would stretch from the 16th century to the 20th and beyond. From the mountains of Peru to the jungles of Colombia, from the plains of Mexico to the streets of Havana, generations of revolutionaries would draw strength from his defiance. But Hatuey's story also invites us to ask deeper questions. What does it mean to resist when you know you will lose? What does it mean to fight for a future you will never see? In this way, Hatuey joins a global pantheon of prophetic resistors, like Spartacus, Boudica, or Tecumseh, figures who stood against impossible odds and, in doing so, revealed the moral bankruptcy of their enemies. His legacy also challenges the sanitized narratives of colonization. For centuries, European empires tried to portray conquest as a civilizing mission. But Hatuey exposes that lie. He saw clearly that conquest was about extraction, domination, and control, and he refused to be part of it, even at the cost of his life. Today, his story remains urgently relevant. In a world still grappling with the legacies of colonialism, racism, and cultural erasure, Hatuey's voice cuts through the noise. He reminds us that resistance begins with refusal. Refusal to forget. Refusal to accept injustice as inevitable. Refusal to kneel before power that denies your humanity. Hatuey lived in a time when hope seemed impossible. Yet he acted, not because he believed he would win, but because he knew it was right. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't wait for allies. He simply stood up. And in doing so, he became the first rebel of the Americas. More than 500 years later, his spirit still walks the forests of Cuba. Still whispers to those willing to listen. Still challenges us to remember the cost of silence and the power of one voice raised in fire.